Good morning and welcome. This is Megan Mansfield from Accordant Company. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar from AvidXchange titled TimberScan Titanium for Sage 100 Contractor. Our presenter today is Mike Carbino, Senior Product Director at AvidXchange. Before we get started, I want to address a few housekeeping items. Everyone is muted for a clean listening experience. If you have any questions, please type them into the questions box. We will collect the questions and address them at the end of the session. For the best viewing experience, please maximize your screen. Today's webinar is being recorded and a link to the recording will be provided via email. With that, I'd like
Megan, did I lose you?
Mike, are you there?
Yes, you started to get cut off there. My apologies, but I'm here.
Okay.
All right.
Over to you, Mike.
Thank you very much, Megan. Greatly appreciated. Welcome, everyone. So this morning, we're going to spend a few minutes talking about TimberScan Titanium for Sage 100 Contractor. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of take us through a bit of a view or lens of what titanium actually does. And then I'll show you some of the application. We're going to focus on some of the key attributes of titanium. So with that, let me just go ahead and work through a couple of PowerPoint slides. So when we think about titanium, we look at it from the perspective of what we call a purchase to pay solution. So the end in mind is for you to have one place to retrieve all of your information around an invoice. And so we do that through the integration with Sage 100 Contractor in these 7 steps that you're seeing here. We start with, what did we purchase? So let's say a purchase order has been written. We're looking at that purchase order, we're reviewing it, and then there perhaps was a receiver that was executed against that particular purchase order. So steps 1 and 2 are basically taking place outside of titanium. But then the invoice arrives, and that's where the action really starts. So what will we build? So now what we're doing is we're taking that invoice and we're matching it against the purchase order and receiver inside titanium. We're not having to do this manually. The system allows for things like optical character recognition. It reads information from the invoice image and populates the invoice entry grid. It allows us to be able to pull up a purchase order directly from Sage 100 Contractor, and we're able to go through and compare the purchase order and or receiver to the invoice. Once we've processed or at least initially reviewed the invoice, then the invoice gets sent off to the approvers. So the approvers are now looking at this and saying, you know, what happened? What did we purchase? What did we receive? And then they go through that coding process. This is all done in titanium as well. So we've built a very flexible but a very robust workflow application that allows, from the time that invoice arrives at your door, to be able to acquire, send the invoice off for approval, and let the approvers do the coding. And then once that coding process is done, the invoices update Sage 100 Contractor, and then from there, we execute the payment. The payment process actually starts in Sage 100 Contractor, just like you're doing today. The difference, however, is that we have the ability to capture that information, pull it back into titanium, and allow you to be able to automate your payment process. Now, that's not to say that every single check that you're going to cut needs to be automated. You could have scenarios where you say, well, we still have certain people that come to knock at our door and we write them a check. That's fine. But it allows you to make the payment process electronic, just like you're making the management of the AP invoice on the front end, all the way through the workflow and then out through the payment process. So that's what titanium does. It allows you to become more efficient because you can manage the invoice from start to finish within the application without having to touch a piece of paper anywhere along the way if you don't want to. Okay, one last kind of view from this, and that's this here. So what we're saying here is, again, that AP purchase to pay process, invoices come in, they get acquired. Once they get acquired, they go off to what we call initial data entry in Titanium. You're keying in an invoice in Titanium, and it basically reflects the same information as if I were keying it directly into Sage 100 Contractor, but we've built additional tools in the application. For example, as I mentioned, the optical character recognition tool to be able to capture information and pre-fill data on the invoice. The invoices get sent to the approvers electronically. So when we got to this step here, step one, we can acquire an invoice from an email where there's no need for anyone to have to touch a piece of paper. It came in, let's say, by email. We were able to acquire it into the application. Once it came into the application, it went to data entry. There's no need for anyone to handle a piece of paper here. It's all done on basically on screen. I'm able to go through and process the invoice, send it off to the approvers. Approvers don't need to touch the piece of paper. They can see it. If they needed to, they could actually call it up on their phone. Once they've gone through the approval process, the invoices update Sage 100 Contractor. And then, as I mentioned, we handle that automated payment process on the back end. So those are the workflow steps. So what I'm going to do then at this point is I'm going to get out of the PowerPoint. I'm going to show you Titanium, and we're going to focus on these steps, but I'm not necessarily going to take you through an end-to-end workflow process with, with an invoice like a full-fledged demo. I'm just going to talk about a few key attributes that hopefully will give you enough information that once you've seen it, you'll be interested in wanting to explore more, and then we can get to that point where we're starting to get into a little bit deeper dive. We can focus specifically on your particular scenario, how you process invoices today, and how we can take that process that you have today and replace it with this automated process that we can do in Titanium. So let's go ahead out of there. I've logged into Titanium, and there are a few things I want to focus on. The first thing I want to talk about is the scenario of being able to manage an invoice. So there are several ways from within Titanium that I can view and manage an invoice. One thing that I have available to me is the ability for me to be able to see the status of invoices. So in this case, what I'm looking at would be, for example, everything that could be outstanding could be for the entire company. You notice here that I have access to be able to see everyone. So I can come in here, I can look and I can see what's outstanding for the entire company. I can also look at the dashboard widgets, and I can see by vendor, by job, by who it's assigned to, by what workflow is associated with this. And then we have other criteria down below that I can actually focus in a little bit more detail if I want to see, for example, by due date, who it's assigned to, by discount date, same type scenario. Now, if I wanted to, what I could potentially do is I could call this up where I'm looking at not just all the users, but I could focus on a particular person. I have a feeling that it's just the same person, as you notice here, but you get the idea where I could actually drill in and I could start looking at various people and seeing what they have outstanding. Also notice as I start to hover the mouse on the dashboard widgets, and I get into the pie chart here, how when I start moving my mouse around the pie chart, it's telling me who the vendor is and what the outstanding dollar amount is. Same thing with the jobs. So I'm able to see by job what we have outstanding and the outstanding dollar amount. So I have all of this information available to me. Now this is just that kind of one lens that I can use to be able to view and manage an invoice. Okay? Let's go to another lens. Let's look at AP invoice entry. and I call up an invoice. So when we call this up, there are a number of different things that I can see from this particular lens. For example, this is an invoice that we've processed against a purchase order. In here, I've actually, all of the information has already been populated. It has referenced the purchase order and it has pulled up the purchase order lines. But in terms of being able to kind of just look at and manage the invoice and understand the information, everything that's available to me, I can do things like I can click on these little inquiry buttons here, and notice how what it does is it will pull up on the purchase order. Here's our committed amount. Here's what we've invoiced. Here's what's currently sitting in titanium, and here's the balance. And if the balance goes negative, it will highlight that in red. I can do the same thing with the job. So I can now look and I can see what's the budget on the job? What are the costs to date? What do we have currently in TimberScan, and what's the balance on the budget? If I had a phase, I could do the same thing on the phase. And you can actually drill in. If I were looking at job cost here, I can go all the way down to the cost code level. And I can see, for example, here's a case where the balance on the budget has gone negative. So it shows me that information right here with the tooltip. Another thing I can do, I can look at any field on this particular screen, and when I click on the history button, I can see all of the invoices for that particular vendor in this case. Bear with me just one second. Okay, so yeah, so I can see all of the invoices for that particular vendor. Another scenario that I could look at, I could be back here if I want to see all of the invoicing for this particular job. I can just go ahead and click on the history here, and now I'm seeing all of the invoices for this particular project. These are all very flexible and very dynamic, so I could, if I wanted to, for example, shift these columns around, or if I needed to perhaps compile a list of all of the invoices for this particular project, I could do that, and I could, download this if I need to. In fact, I could even go one step further. And again, this is another view and another way that I can go through and kind of manage the invoice process. So I'll go to the inquiries, and if I bring up, for example, the invoice status inquiry, notice all the options that I have available to me for me to be able to go out and select information associated with an invoice. If I want to boil this down by who the vendor is, what job it's associated with, I can do all of those things. I can even focus in on specific invoices if I need to. I can go to specific purchase orders and I can see it that way. Now, ultimately, what I might want to be able to do is I might be able to want to compile backup for something like a substantiated billing. So for that, what I can do is I can click on the report button. I could say, let me go ahead and create PDF attachments here. And I will say, let me take all of the invoices and all of the associated combined documents that may have been attached to the invoice. And I'm just going to go ahead and create a report off of that. So when I do that, what the system will do is it will download a report that will look like this. So here's all the kind of my header information for that report. And then right behind it, I have all of the associated invoices that are attached. That's how quickly and easily I'm able to access information from within the application. So it gives you that type of reporting and ability to be able to go out and look at information at any given time. So all of your invoices that you need are going to be here. They're going to be at your access and give you the ability to be able to go through and process those invoices and see everything you need associated with the invoice. Now let's look at another scenario. We've talked about kind of managing the invoice itself, and the different ways that I can quickly go about reporting and access. So let's talk about a few other things. And I mentioned when we were when we were looking at the PowerPoint slide, the ability for me to be able to manage an invoice from start to finish without ever having to touch a piece of paper. How do we do that? Well, first of all, let's say, for example, that invoice came in by way of email. What you could do is we have an email monitoring program, and it would allow me to be able to take that invoice and acquire it into the application without me having to go print the invoice out or put it onto a scanner and scan it. The email monitoring tool will just drop that those invoices into a file for me, and they'll allow me to be able to go out and just acquire those invoices. Or I can just go ahead and drag and drop the invoice. So if I needed to just go ahead and drag and drop, for example, in this case, I can pull up the invoice. I can go through and scroll through the various pages if I need to, separate the invoice if I needed to split pages, and then I go ahead and I acquire the invoice. So step one, I never had to touch a piece of paper. I brought it into the application. The AP invoice entry queue, again, allows me where I can view the invoice. I started to show you this before, where you're able to see everything associated with the invoice, and you don't have to print the invoice out. If I need to see the invoice in more detail, I can do things like move this particular invoice around. So I could say, let's just switch this over. I want to see the invoice image on one side. I want to see my data entry grid on the other. So it's those types of things that I can do. I can go and key the information in. Or what I can also do is I could take the invoice image and I can just disconnect it. Maybe I have dual screens. So I want to take the invoice, move it off to a second screen. So now I've got the invoice on one screen. I've got my AP entry on the other. AP entry, as I mentioned, this is basically a replication of what happens in Sage 300 CRE. However, there are a number of tools that we've built. I already talked about the ability to be able to go out and do history on any field. I mentioned how you can use these tooltips to be able to just go through and display information about a job, about a purchase order, etc. We also have optical character recognition. What that does is that allows me to go out and extract information from the invoice image and pre-populate the invoice entry grid. So in this case, I don't have to go through and put in the invoice number. The system found that invoice number off of the invoice and it populated it for me. I didn't have to put in the invoice date, the amount due. The system found that information. It plugged that in for me. I referenced the purchase order here, and it went ahead and it pre-populated the purchase order or the distribution with the purchase order details coming directly from Sage 100 Contractor. And then when I'm ready, I go ahead and I hit save and route, and it routes that invoice off to the approvers. Okay, let's talk about another step in terms of, again, managing the invoice from that efficiency standpoint and never having to touch a piece of paper. Approvers can call up their invoices. They don't have to necessarily be in the office. They could be on their phone and they could still view their invoice in any format that they need to. So I can actually call up the invoice, and this is hard for me to simulate on the screen here, but if I were to kind of switch this around a little bit, see if it will work for me here. Not quite. It's hard to simulate using just the screen, but the whole idea is I'm able to go through here, see the invoice image in full, and then use the tools here at the bottom of the screen to be able to go through and code if I need to. So again, the whole concept, the idea is I can actually approve invoices from anywhere. I don't necessarily have to be able to be in Titanium in order to do this. Let's bring this back. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and switch this format back. Here we go. Okay. All right, so again, the idea here is, we're going through, we're managing the invoices. We're never touching a piece of paper anywhere along the way. Now, invoices are getting to Sage 100 Contractor. How does that happen? It happens because the approval process, where I've set up my workflows, allows me to be able to not only get the invoice after it's gone through AP and it's gone out to the approver, but once that approved invoice has been, we'll call it completed, it then sends that invoice over to Sage 100 Contractor. When it does so, it doesn't just update the Sage 100 Contractor with the data. So you notice here, here's an invoice that was not keyed into Sage 100 Contractor. This was keyed in and processed through Titanium, and then it was sent to Sage 100 Contractor after it was approved. So in addition to being able to send over the data, Titanium also sends over the images. So in this case, I'm able to see the invoice and any of the supporting documents associated with that particular invoice all the way down to the payment record. So it gives me that functionality, as you see. Okay, kind of a final step in the process here, and that is the whole payment execution. So hopefully what you've seen so far, without me going through a lot of necessarily details of how we would create the workflows for your specific scenario, but more of a general overview. But hopefully what you've been able to see is how we're able to create these scenarios where I'm able to manage the invoice, see everything associated with the invoice, acquire the invoice without having to touch the piece of paper, route the invoice off for approval with very little entry that's needed along the way, approve the invoice, send it off to Sage 100 Contractor, and then from here, we get to that kind of final step in the process. And this, let's see here. Let's see if we can get this open. Sorry, we have a little bit of a timeout issue with, if I set this to a certain time period for the system to log me out. Okay, so let's say, for example, that I were in Sage 100 Contractor and I decided that I wanted to go through and do my vendor payments. So the process starts the same as it does in Sage 100 today. You go through, you select your invoices to pay, you choose to pay your vendors, but instead of actually printing out those quote unquote checks out to a physical printer, what Titanium does is it will allow you to extract the information from Sage 100 Contractor and bring it back here. So in Titanium, what I'm able to do is I can come in and I could look at my payment records that I was originally going to send to a printer, but I decided, no, I'm going to actually do it this way. So when I send it here, what it does is it gives me a view where I'm seeing what looks like a check. It has the Sage check number that it was assigned. It has the check date, the dollar amount, it has a check stub, and then it references the invoices that check is paying. What it also does is it attaches a copy of the invoice and all the supporting documents behind the invoice, all the way down to something we call the approval page. So another thing that I think is important to emphasize is that with every single document, every single invoice that gets processed, there's also something called the approval page that gets attached. And what this does is this allows for you to be able to see every iteration of the invoice, when it was received, when it was entered, when it was approved. So everyone along the way, if there were 10 approvers, you would see all 10 approvers that were listed here. But back to where I was before. Okay, so what is the purpose of this particular view that I'm looking at? Well, basically what it's here for is in many scenarios, checks get printed, checks are attached to the invoices that they pay, and then those checks have to be handed off to someone, and someone has to go through and view the payment and decide, are we going to go ahead and release this payment? I'm going to sign off on it or not. And when that happens, basically, in this case, we've actually done all of the work. So when I keep talking about you don't have to touch a piece of paper, you don't have to print checks. You don't have to take the check, attach it to the invoices, and then hand it off for review and approval. This is all done electronically. I can view it on the screen. I can say, okay, yep, this is good to go, and I approve it. It sends it to the Avid Pay Network, and then Avid Exchange will pay your vendors just like a bank would on your behalf. It can be done by ACH, it could be done by a virtual card, it could be done by an actual check. The vendor makes the choice. We're just managing the process to eliminate you from having to print checks, put them in the mail them out, having to worry about check fraud. All of those things go away. And then the final step is being able to kind of manage the checks. So I've talked about managing the invoices all along the way. What we're able to also do is once we've released those payment records to the Avid Pay Network, we want to be able to see what the status is. This gives us that view. So in this case, I could look at a particular payment to Alpha Insulation, for example. I could see when the payment was made. I could see how it was made. In this case, it was virtual card. I could see what bank account it was drawn from, the check number that we generated from Sage 100 Contractor, the total dollar amount, and I could see what the status is. Here, if I needed to, I can always call up what's called the proof of payment document that gets attached to the invoice. And this shows me everything that took place with that particular payment. It's basically like almost like a check stub verification. And then finally, what I could also do, and you could also email that out to a vendor if you needed to. And then finally, when you click on the plus sign, it shows you everything that took place all along the way in the processing of that particular payment. So think of this as more of that, I refer to it as kind of the UPS tracking tool. So I'm able to go through and see everything that happened all along the way, when the status changed and what precipitated that status change. Okay. So basically what I've done in a very short period of time is kind of walked you through a scenario where invoices have come in. We've been able to process the invoices, send them off for review and approval. I'm able to manage the invoice all along the way, as you saw the different tools that I had to be able to do that. And then once the payment process has been executed, we can manage all of the payments as well and release the funds to the vendor. Everything gets controlled from within Titanium. Everything is managed from within here. We're creating efficiencies. We're eliminating those manual steps of having to take an invoice when it comes in, put it in someone's folder, put it on someone's desk, then, try to, shrug your shoulders and figure out when are we going to get that invoice back so that we can actually code it and get it into Sage 100 Contractor. All of that goes away. You use the system to be able to do all of that, and it can all be done electronically as opposed to having to do it manually. And with that, we're going to keep this short and sweet. Megan, I think we're probably at a good point to be able to stop and just ask if there are any questions.
Hey, Mike, thanks very much. There are no questions in the chat. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat, or I can actually unmute if you would like to ask some questions. So let me do that. Okay, the mics are live. If anybody has any questions. No, Mike, there doesn't seem to be any questions. So, with that, we can conclude the webinar. Thank you very much for participating. Thank you, Mike.